Jerusalem, joining us via Skype, and president of the NGO Monitor and professor of political science at Bar-Ilan University. What is the point of this law in your mind right now? Because the arguments sound valid when you're listening to the other, to the opposition, so to speak. Does it really matter who funds an NGO? And especially in this day and age, where left and right are so divided, a bill as such, what can it do?
I'm not in favor of this particular bill or any legislation right now, but I think we need to understand the background behind this. This is a big deal. This is not a trivial issue, and it's not a left and right issue only. It's not only about some sort of symbolic actions in terms of making things more transparent. That's not going to change very much. This is a huge political and in many ways an economic issue for Israel. The NGO industry in Israel is huge. And there is no other country in the world, certainly no other democratic country in the world, in which so much foreign government money is pouring in. We're talking about tens of millions at least of euros and krona and pounds and other funds that are coming in to a very small group of very powerful actors in one part of the political spectrum. So we have Breaking the Silence, and we have B'Tselem, and we have a group called 972, and there are just many of them. Most Israelis have never heard of these organizations. A lot of them do all of their work outside of the country, and there they are campaigning against the government, which is legitimate. The question is, should European governments, should any government be interfering and manipulating in the politics of another democratic government in Israel the way that the European Union and its member states do? So the money is huge, and that is really what this is behind this. This is not the first time, and we all know that this has been percolating for 5 or 6 years. I think this is the first time we have a government, the justice minister, and other members of the government that are really determined to change the status quo. And the message that we're sending, that is being sent to the members of parliament in Europe and elsewhere, most of whom know nothing about the details. The 50 people who signed the main letter, those are people who are BDS activists, many of them. They know nothing. They don't really care. They say they're worried about Israel's image and democracy. They don't really care. They are actors. They are the people who are supplying the money to the same NGOs that are getting this outside of the Israeli democratic process. So that's really the issue here. And although it's left and right, it's portrayed that way, it's really much more about Israel and Europe, and the way in which Europe is seen as interfering in a very blatant and non-democratic way in the Israeli political process.
I'm just going to, and I would love for you, Mr. Steinberg, to stay with us, because, and a case in point, I'm half Israeli. I do know all these people that you mentioned. I think they're very much in the news. That's just one argument. But when it comes to, if you're listening to that, Mr. Beck, okay, if you're listening to Mr. Steinberg, what would be your counter-arguments to the fact that this is interfering with the politics of a country by another country?
Well, it makes the assumption that the governments who are providing these grants are somehow dictating the agenda, and that is completely false. And it also makes the assumption that this money is somehow already not transparent, already not sort of in the public sphere. The whole reason NGO Monitor can do its job is because we report 4 times a year, because the governments already list who they give grants to, because it is already so transparent. We're proud of every single supporter, private, foundations, institutions who support the Association for Civil Rights in Israel. So it's not really the issue. And the money that is sort of dark, that we don't know, that there isn't transparency, isn't the $20 or $30 million that come into the human rights community. It's the several $100 million that's coming in through U.S. 501c3s and other instruments through donor-advised giving, where the intent is much less clear, that's supporting right-wing organizations, settlement activities, and so forth.
Mr. Steinberg, if you're still with us on it, there is the argument that people will bring on the other side, that money that's given to NGOs or to groups that are on the different spectrum, so to speak, the different, the other side of the political dial, is not as transparent as is requested right now by this bill from left-leaning organizations.
Well, let's remember that Mr. Beck and the Association of Civil Rights in Israel is a recipient. They're players. They're part of the industry. And, of course, they're going to defend it. The claim that there are hundreds of millions of dark money coming into right-wing organizations is just made up. There is enough knowledge of where that money is and where it's coming from, and a lot of it goes to the left. George Soros provides lots of money to the New Israel Fund. The New Israel Fund supports Mr. Beck's group and another 30 or 40 similar political groups. That's a red herring. The fact is that this is about government-to-government relations and about whether Israel is a sovereign nation or not, and why there are double standards that are focusing primarily on Israel. And I think that's a key issue that we shouldn't lose sight of. And that's why I'm proposing, instead of having this legislation, we had the first reading, it was passed. It was passed, as Tal Shalev mentioned, by a reasonably large margin.
Right.
A number of people abstained, which was interesting, including Michael Oren. There were people who were opposed to the legislation, but see this as a very serious problem. And so the alternative, which is something that I think needs to be discussed more, and I am discussing it, in fact, this evening with members of the European Parliament who are in Israel, with members of the Knesset who are not ideological, there are a few of them, and see the problem in more diplomatic terms and more sovereignty terms, the idea of negotiations with the European Union. In fact, Mr. Lapid, Yair Lapid, has proposed, and I think it's a good idea, that he take that the Knesset create a committee of 4 members from different parties, both government and opposition, and that the European Parliament select 4 members from different parties from their group, and that guidelines are negotiated. For instance, there is absolutely no reason that any European government should give money to an organization that's blatant anti-Semitism, and yet that happens. They have all sorts of excuses for why they do it. The Europeans, by the way, may not dictate the details, but they give money for very specific purposes. It really is acting as a foreign agent. So let's have these discussions, not through legislation, but let's have it through negotiations and reaching some sort of set of rules and guidelines, which is the way diplomacy should work.
Mr. Beck, would you think that that's something that would work?
Well, this is the current narrative that they're trying to sell, that there's no reason for foreign governments to be supporting human rights defenders or civil society organizations in Israel or any country because there's already government-to-government relations. Well, that's not really, you're not really dealing with apples and apples and oranges. You know, the reason that private foundations and that governments support work like ours, we get money from the U.S. government to help pay for our anti-racism education program. It's because it's an issue of shared values. This whole campaign against foreign money, what's particularly disturbing about it is that it's taking Israel's closest allies, Western European states, the United States, our key ally, and turning their actions in Israel towards protecting our democratic space into something subversive. And that narrative is starting to sink in, and that's the reason why organizations like ours need to speak out. This money is not about them dictating an agenda. It is not about subversing anything. It is not about anything other than Israeli organizations like ours trying to protect our democratic space.
And I think it's going to remain divisive at this point in time, and sadly also all the time that we have for this segment. I want to